it's not transparency for transparency's sake. Nobody wants to be doing business with people who lie to them. All my years working with these big brands and manufacturers, nobody wants to be, engaged in human trafficking or forced labor. If it's happening, they want to know. They want to know very soon because they also want to find other suppliers before other people find out. I mean, there's a whole slew of reasons that morally people feel they deserve to know if you buy something that it should be made in ways that adhere to your standards.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hi, and welcome to Hidden Traffic. I am thrilled today to have as my guest the founder and CEO of Sourcemap, Leo Bonanni. Hi, Leo. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Gwen. Great to be here.
So I don't know really a lot about your background, except that you have a PhD from MIT, which is very impressive. So fill us in a little bit about your history and how you came to be working in the area of supply chain integrity.
I came from a completely other line of work, but I was doing media studies at the MIT Media Lab, and the topic area I chose to focus on was sustainability and sustainable supply chains in particular. And the reason that a media researcher would look at supply chains and sustainability is that sustainability has long been the specialty of communications professionals and CSR, PR. Mm-hmm. And that's how we encounter it as a general public. We see articles in the press about something happening in some supply chain somewhere far away. And so at the same time, there was a huge shift happening when I was in grad school, which was this shift towards citizen-generated, so user-generated content, being uploaded to the web. And so anybody could say anything about it, anything, anytime. And at the same time, as far as we knew, global supply chains were still just a black box. And so I saw this convergence of democratizing, open dissemination of ideas. And as far as we knew as engineers, very hard to figure out the impact of industry, the impact of product, really how to make the right choices. And I basically connected the two and said, okay, there's going to be, through social media, at some point in the near future, supply chains are going to become transparent. It's a matter, of course, if I can find out what somebody else is having for lunch halfway around the world, I should definitely be able to find out in what factory my running shoes were made and in what conditions. And so this sort of small world thesis, this transparency thesis led me to turned out basically a social media platform, but for sharing supply chain data, which I called Sourcemap. And the impetus was, in a world of greenwashing, you reveal where things come from, you map it kind of like on a Google map. All of a sudden you can't greenwash because all of the data is out there for anyone to see and measure and verify. And then I basically went out on the market with my supply chain mapping software to see if there were any takers. And sure enough, there were, even back when I launched in 2011, there were a whole bunch of companies that had apparently been looking for a way to figure out exactly what was going on in their supply chains. They were excited to use the cloud to do that. And they were excited to figure out, where they could also gain a competitive edge by mapping their supply chains. And so we started working with them, and that's how Sourcemap was born.
That's fantastic. It never would have occurred to me to use a social media platform in connection with getting transparency into a supply chain. So cool idea. I will tell you, I'm a little skeptical because I've worked for a number of manufacturing companies and I know a lot of in-house compliance people who will tell you, we have hundreds of thousands of suppliers. There's no way we could map the supply chain. That's impossible. It would take us, 1 million man hours. It's not doable. It's not feasible. And they also like to throw in the reference to, do you know how many different enterprise risk management systems we have and EAPs we have? We're using 5 versions of SAP in this facility alone. So I take it that skepticism is something that you don't agree with.
I mean, first of all, I can say that they are completely right about, the state of enterprise technology in many companies today, even. So it's absolutely true. SAP and other these softwares are heavy and difficult to use and mostly difficult to network through. So the idea that you could, what we ended up having to do is the reason I call it a social network is because when you manage an extended supply chain, you need to talk to not just your suppliers, but your suppliers' suppliers and their suppliers. Basically,
Exactly.
we call it a friend of a friend network. And you just can't do that with traditional ERP. Our first engagements, we would actually have to go find the server in the basement of the factory where the data lived.
Exactly.
Right? So they weren't
Yep.
they weren't in the cloud. So there was no internet. It was like a Rolodex. It was a Rolodex world. And we were showing up with Facebook and we said, well, yeah, how come you don't know your cousin's friend's wife? They really were never built for that. So I think trying to jam current enterprise software into this task is a round peg in a square hole. And that means that, by the way, that a lot of companies don't have the business processes or even the right staffing to begin this project, because you need to be ready to have something to say to these suppliers that you ultimately discover in tier 2, tier 3. There's a business transformation. Digitization is part of it. On the flip side, if you're willing to use a new generation of technology and you have 100,000 suppliers, that is like the smallest social network ever. Right? These social networks are
when you
built
put
to
it
handle
that way.
billions
Yeah,
of,
you're right.
of suppliers. So we go in there and we basically put in this heavy duty technology and we pick up a few PDFs and a few emails and phone numbers and we map a few dots. So it is well within what software can do to map every stakeholder in a supply chain, but well outside of what legacy enterprise software was made to do.
So in-house practitioners need to really kind of broaden their minds as to what tools they're looking at, right? So historically, we're told that we have to operate within the SAP system or whatever other ERP system is there. And you're saying, well, no, there's more. There's more out there.
That's right. These are not at odds with each other. We connect to the SAP or other ERP systems because that's where the vendor master database lives. That's where the purchase orders live. And at the end of the day, all that these new requirements are saying is, well, for that purchase order from that vendor, now you go to that vendor and you get the rest of the information. So who subcontracted, which pieces were done where were the raw materials coming from? And we're just fleshing it out. So you take the SAP database and then you augment it with this world of data. And it is much faster to do that on a new networked interface than to try to jam that back into the ERP, which was never made to do that in the first place.
So I'm going to read a quote from your Senate Finance Committee testimony, which is very impressive, by the way. And you said that your tool uses a unique social network to help companies identify all of the actors in their supply chain down to the names and addresses of every mine, every farm, every factory, every warehouse. That just seems like a dream solution to me and entirely impossible. So tell me a little bit more about how the social network gets to that place. I think about my kind of entry into this area was conflict minerals work. And we had a heck of a time trying to get suppliers to even respond to let us know whether or not they had conflict minerals in their goods, let alone where it came from. So I'm envisioning kind of a big thumb pressing down on a supplier demanding information. Is it reliant on suppliers responding to you, or is there more intelligence that's involved here?
You're absolutely right in your reservations. Let's say also the technology is one piece of the pie. The other piece is the considerable commercial pressure that goes along with this. And so you're totally right. 10 years ago, this was basically unthinkable. And it's been gradually adopted inside industries. But gradually, I mean, it's been more than a decade now, and some industries still haven't begun mapping. So what we've seen is the following. So absolutely, the problem is if you don't know who your suppliers are and you can't get them to talk to you, then any issue you identify around them is not going to be able to be resolved, and you'll ultimately have to find an alternate supply. So yes, ultimately, if your suppliers won't respond to you, there's a problem. And no amount of market intelligence or snooping around is going to address that problem, because you ultimately need to prove to customs that you have a functioning relationship with these people. So we need them to respond. The biggest leverage is really large buyers and entire groups of buyers inside an industry going and asking their suppliers for the same data in the same way. So if you streamline the data collection, you give them the tools to collect and verify the data, and you do it, as part of your commercial relationship, it's tough for the first adopter within an industry. And then as more of them do it, And to give you an idea, we're in some very difficult to map industries like the cocoa sector in West Africa, where the majority of these tiny little cocoa farms that are, smallholder managed are mapped down to somebody having walked around the edge of the farm and measured it. In places with no electricity, in places with limited internet, if there's a good enough commercial incentive, transparency happens. Mostly has to do with that. They're not insignificant commercial incentives. In the case of cocoa, the premium, cash that gets paid.
That's a great segue into what was my next question, which is what are some of those industries? You touched on cocoa, but are there others where there's, a collective mass that has been a tipping point, if you will, that has been reached that makes this easier to accomplish than in other industries?
Absolutely. And by the way, because cocoa was my favorite because it was the first to trust us to do this, and because it really showed that with a will to collect more data, brands would also co-invest with their suppliers to build the technology to have mapping and traceability in place. And so it showed, you want more data, but you're willing to invest for more data. Yes, cocoa was the first. Coffee, palm oil, beef, especially concerns around deforestation, came in rapid succession. All of these commodities were in the practice of mapping down to the raw material before 2016, when the loophole in the U.S. Tariff Act was closed, and then all of a sudden the U.S. started to enforce the forced labor ban on a variety of other raw materials. And since then, that's really led the way in terms of entire groups of companies going and adopting this. And so the big swings you've seen have been with cotton, not just for apparel, but it's in pharmaceutical products, it's in housewares, it's in toys. And so basically, with a drive towards a cotton traceability, essentially now, during 2021, we saw it go from very low response rate to routinely mapping it down to the gin just upon asking a question. And then now we're seeing it with many of the metals and also amorphous polysilicons that go into solar panels. So all of those ingredients that go into cars, the aerospace industry, the solar industry are now under scrutiny as well. Now that it's flipped into a regulatory and compliance space, even easier for people to get responses because the suppliers know it's not just a way to get a premium, it's a way to get access to the U.S. market.
Yeah, it's now hit kind of a critical mass legislatively as well, because as we've talked about before, now you're looking at things like the new German Due Diligence Act that is believed to soon to be a new EU Due Diligence Act. And as you mentioned, the WRO's withhold and release orders, they're coming out of U.S. Customs. It all seems to be coalescing along with kind of this ESG movement, right? Which is that in order to be a good company, a good corporate citizen, you really have to have that level of transparency through your supply chain. So let's talk for a second. You mentioned earlier kind of the idea of walking around, boots on the ground, and looking at a cocoa farm and seeing the perimeter. What part does audit and that kind of eyes on people, boots on the ground, play in the solution that you have? Is it something that is built into the kind of social network idea, or is it an additional add-on service, or how does that work for this solution?
Audits were they were the predominant technique used to manage social and environmental performance in extended supply chains until recently. They're never going away. They're very important. And the way that it was traditionally done was through systems, they're sometimes called mass balance, where you would certify an entire volume of production from a producer or a group of producers and say, these are all certified because, we've audited a certain number of them on a certain basis. And we found that, the audits were good. And so we're going to certify the whole volume. And of course, what you ended up discovering was that people who were trying to not follow the standards would pass the product through an audited producer. And since only a few of the producers were ever audited, there was really no accounting for whether too much stuff was passing through a good one, and all of a sudden the bad ones were going completely ignored. So what we've done is basically expanded on the power of audits, if you will. What we're doing is collecting far less data, but from all of the actors in a high-risk region. And that data includes data about productivity and payroll. So we know the volumes being output, we know the number of people on payroll, and we know the production capacity. So if the farm is too small, there's clearly something being smuggled from another farm that we don't know. So we try to make sure
of some kind. Yeah.
Exactly. It's the oldest trick in the book, but you have one great factory right near the airport that everyone audits, and it produces 10 times more stuff than it ever should because nobody wants to take. And that's the other flip side of it. So now the audits are not being done purely at random or convenience. They're being done based on where the data is showing red flags. So with that horizontal look at everything, we raise the flags. The audits are still there, and the audits are actually part of the commercial incentive. So you have more problems, more corrective actions, more audits, less problems, less audits. That becomes a kind of a reward.
It's an incentive that works. Yeah, exactly. So I've heard a few people prognosticate that really we shouldn't worry too much about mapping out the supply chain because in the next few years, and it's always some amorphous time period, we're all going to be using blockchain. And so blockchain will solve this problem. So we don't need to worry about it. If you hang out another few years, then we'll get to blockchain and it'll be fine. I don't know everything there is to know or even a lot about blockchain, but it occurs to me that you couldn't really put a blockchain solution in place without having already mapped your supply chain. How else are you going to assign blocks and the automatic contract functions and the funding functions to certain suppliers unless you know who they are?
Aside from all the other good reasons that you should know who you're in business with, which
well, yes,
I think the whole discussion of automatically managing your supply chain without ever having to know is a bit outside the realm of relevant. But blockchain is a very sophisticated technology that allows a certain kind of data sharing between really sophisticated actors. And that's why you saw IBM pushing it so hard with pilots between, Walmart and Procter & Gamble. Say, okay, of course. The companies that have the most money, the best technology, and their supply chains are basically married. And we'll use blockchain. Effectively, what's nice for blockchain for Walmart is that everybody pays for their own blockchain. Walmart doesn't pay for any of it. It's a win-win as far as they're concerned. You go to a conflicted cobalt mine in the DRC, and you're facing a whole different set of issues. And in fact, anywhere where there is a risk of forced labor, conflict, deforestation, obviously people are going to be trying to dodge oversight and smuggle the goods through another
controls. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And so for me, as an enterprise software guy, the last thing I'm going to try to do is get every single person to agree to use this fancy new technology with which they're also going to receive payment before I engage in the task of monitoring the supply chain, because we're much more in an urgent situation of having to immediately identify and rectify risks. And so convincing people to adopt blockchain is a long ways from today. Right now, we're happy if they have an Android phone. Occasionally, they get a signal on it enough that we could, geocode them. Make sure it's who they say they are. Make sure we have the receipts and the bills of lading. It's early days before the entire world decides to use the exact same standard for sharing transaction data with each other.
Yeah, I can imagine. So that brings me kind of to the final point here, which is that the reason that I have you on the podcast today and why I'm really excited about what you're doing is because it seems like this is the best way, not only to move towards a more socially responsible model for business, but to help cut off some of the demand side of human trafficking. Because we realize that human trafficking is not often something that people are, and when I say people, I mean corporations, aren't directly contracting for. They're not raising the phone and saying, hey, please get me 50 trafficked workers. What's happening is they're hiring a supplier who hires a sub and a sub and a sub, and it goes down so far that we lose visibility to it. So this solution seems to me like an amazing way to get visibility through. And arguably, theoretically, at least, when you have visibility, then you can eliminate. Is that fair?
I mean, that's right. It's not transparency for transparency's sake. Nobody wants to be doing business with people who lie to them. All my years working with these big brands and manufacturers, nobody wants to be, engaged in human trafficking or forced labor. If it's happening, they want to know. They want to know very soon because they also want to find other suppliers before other people find out. I mean, there's a whole slew of reasons that morally people feel they deserve to know if you buy something that it should be made in ways that adhere to your standards.
Ethical.
And increasingly, these corporates have realized it. If you look at the evolution in 10 years, they moved from a corporate social responsibility as mainly a communications activity into this new function called responsible sourcing, which sits inside procurement. And it basically says we won't sign a contract with a supplier if they can't convince us that they are adhering to our standards. And that shift of actually big corporates spending the money where their values are has swung billions of dollars towards more sustainable supply chains. It's moved industries, out of entire regions of the world, and it's really sent a signal, which is it's mutually beneficial, right? Suppliers they've seen that swing. They're now providing more data. They're being proactive about implementing systems and communicating about them because they know they can get to market faster. And brands are getting accustomed to having that visibility, and they don't want to do business with people who won't provide it.
So in effect, you're building a virtuous circle, right? A circle of people who are not only doing the right thing, but they're making money because of it, it's a built-in incentive. That's the way to go.
I mean, it's all profit driven, right? It's at the end of the day, if it doesn't make money, it's not going to get adopted widely. The good news is, knowing who you're buying from also helps with a whole bunch of operational issues. And we always try to tell, we might be getting a call from the general counsel or the procurement director. We say, but, have you checked with your quality control people? Have you checked with your commodity trading desk? Go check. Believe me, they also would like to know more about their extended supply chains. And together, that the best projects are those in which multiple parts of a company come together and say, yep, we're no longer going to do business without knowing who we're really in business with.
It builds its own business case. Yeah. So if people want to learn more about Sourcemap, where should they do that?
It's an easy one, sourcemap.com. And you can see some of the biggest and most recognizable brands you buy from have actually published their supply chains publicly. We have this big enterprise software that we sell, but then as a kind of a reward at the end of the road, big companies are also publishing their supply chains for your benefit. And those you can find at open.sourcemap.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today, Leo. It's been insightful and interesting and exciting. It encourages me to hear that people like you are out there building this kind of solution because it'll make the world a better place. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gwen. It's been a pleasure.